Imagine, for a moment, the sound of a world that has never known the footfall of a city. It is not a silence of emptiness, but a heavy, pressurized roar, the sound of air moving across a continent of frozen glass. Deep in the southern reaches of our planet, the katabatic winds descend from the high polar plateau. These are gravity-driven winds, cold and dense, picking up speed as they tumble down the icy slopes toward the sea. They do not whistle. They groan with the weight of thousands of miles of unobstructed space. To the modern mind, this is the edge of the world, a place of absolute isolation where the map simply ends in a white void. We have been taught that this is a land without a past, a continent that remained a ghost until the 19th century, when wooden ships first braved the crushing pack ice. But as we drift into the depths of history, we must ask if our memory of this place is as fragile as the ice itself. Beyond the 60th parallel, the Southern Ocean becomes a churning barrier, a wild grey expanse of water that encircles the bottom of the globe. Sailors call these latitudes the screaming 60s, where the waves can rise like mountains and the spray freezes before it touches the deck. For centuries, mainstream science has maintained that this barrier was impenetrable to ancient peoples, that the great white South was a realm reserved only for the gods or the void. Yet, when we look closely at the edges of our understanding, at the fragments of lore and the strange anomalies in the soil, the story begins to shift. There is a quiet, persistent mystery humming beneath the ice, a suggestion that human eyes may have gazed upon these jagged blue glaciers over 1,000 years before the first European explorers claimed their discovery. The isolation of Antarctica is not just physical, it is a conceptual distance that we have placed between ourselves and the deep past. We think of the ancient world as small and disconnected, yet the more we uncover, the more we realize that the horizons of our ancestors were vast. They followed the stars and the migrations of the great whales. They moved with a patience that the modern world has long since forgotten. As you settle into your blankets and the world around you grows still, try to feel the immense scale of that journey. Imagine a voyaging canoe, carved from heavy timber and bound with coconut husk fibre, cresting a wave in the cold southern mist. The air is thinning, the temperature is dropping, and ahead, through the fog, a wall of white rises from the sea. If you are settling in for the night and finding comfort in these distant echoes of the past, you are exactly where you belong. Here at the Slumber Archives, we believe that history is the finest lullaby, and we bring you new narrations of forgotten ages every single day. If you find these journeys into the unknown help you find rest, please consider subscribing to our channel so we can continue to walk these quiet paths together. A gentle like on the video also helps others find their way to our fireside, but for now, let the weight of the present fade away as we return to the spray and the ice of the southern sea. In the oral traditions of the Polynesian people, there is a figure named Ui-te-Rangiora. It is said that in the 7th century he led his people south in a great vessel called the Te Tai-uka-a-pia. The legends speak of a place he called the Tai-uka-a-pia, a term that translates to the sea foaming like arrowroot. To those who know the plant, arrowroot when scraped into water creates a white viscous froth, a striking metaphor for the slush and pancake ice found in the Antarctic waters. The stories tell of a place of bare white rocks that towered into the sky and a sea where the sun did not set. To a navigator from the warm islands of the Pacific, such a sight would have been more than a discovery. It would have been a descent into a different dimension of existence. Mainstream archaeology often demands physical proof, something tangible like a hearth or a tool left behind in the frozen earth. This is a field governed by stratigraphy, which is simply the study of layers in the ground, much like the pages of a book where the oldest stories are buried at the bottom. But in a land like Antarctica, where the ice is constantly moving, grinding, and flowing toward the sea, the pages of that book are often shredded. Anything left on the surface is swallowed by the snows of a single season, and anything left on the coast is eventually carried away by the calving glaciers. We are left to look for the shadows of presence, the subtle chemical signatures in the soil, or the persistent memories passed down through 60 generations of storytellers. There is a concept in deep time known as the Younger Dryas, a period roughly 12,800 years ago, when the Earth's climate took a sudden, violent turn toward the cold. While this is much older than the voyages of the Polynesians, it reminds us that the Earth is a shifting, breathing entity. The coastlines we see today are not the coastlines of the past. As the great ice sheets melt and grow, the sea levels rise and fall, hiding entire landscapes beneath hundreds of feet of water. What if the evidence we seek is not under the ice, but under the waves? The continental shelf of Antarctica was once much broader, a fringe of tundra that might have supported life before the weight of the glaciers pushed the land down into the mantle. Consider the sensory experience of those early mariners. They would have noticed the change in the birds first, the arrival of the petrels and the albatrosses that live their entire lives on the wing in the southern gale. They would have seen the water turn from the brilliant turquoise of the tropics to a deep, bruised indigo, and then finally to a slate grey. The smell of the air would have changed, losing the scent of salt and damp earth, replaced by a crystalline purity that burns the back of the throat. It is a scent of absolute stillness. When they reached the ice, they were not just reaching a new land, they were reaching the limits of the human spirit's endurance. We often assume that because a journey is difficult, it was not made. But the history of our species is a history of the impossible. We are the creatures who crossed the Bering Land Bridge in the teeth of a glacial maximum. We are the ones who navigated the open Pacific using only the feel of the swells against the hull of a boat. The silence of the southern ice is not necessarily a silence of absence. It may simply be a silence of waiting. The ice holds its secrets tightly, preserved in a deep freeze that defies the passage of centuries. Every bubble of air trapped in a glacier is a time capsule, a sample of the atmosphere from 1,000 or 10,000 years ago. As we move forward into this mystery, we must be willing to listen to the things that science cannot yet measure. We must look at the maps that shouldn't exist, maps from the Renaissance that seem to show the coastline of a southern continent long before it was officially discovered. We must look at the radiocarbon dating, a method of measuring the decay of carbon atoms to tell us how long ago a living thing died, and see what it tells us about the ancient fires that may have burned on the Sub-Antarctic islands. The mystery of the loneliest continent is not just about who got there first. It is about the realization that we have never been as alone as we thought. The ice is a mirror, and when we look into its depths, we see the flickering shadows of those who went before us, drifting through the mist, watching the white foam of the arrowroot sea. The ocean does not remember the wakes of the ships that cross it, but the stars. The stars keep a silent record of every horizon chased by the restless mind. Long before the iron hulls of the 19th century ground against the ice, there was a people who looked at the vast blue void of the Pacific not as a barrier, but as a highway. These were the descendants of the Lapita, a culture of master voyaging that flourished 3,000 years ago, spreading their language and their seeds across the scattered jewels of the Polynesian Triangle. They did not possess the compass or the sextant, yet they held a map of the entire world within the architecture of their memory. They read the sea like a living manuscript, feeling the subtle change in the water's temperature against the hull, or the way a specific bird's flight path signaled the presence of land just beyond the curve of the earth. As the centuries drifted by, these wayfinders refined a system of celestial navigation so sophisticated it borders on the poetic. They knew the rising and setting points of over 200 stars, creating a mental star compass that allowed them to steer with unerring precision across thousands of miles of open water. They watched the telltale clouds that gathered over distant lagoons and listened to the deep, resonant boom of the surf reflecting off unseen islands. To them, the ocean was a grid of energy, a network of swells and currents that could be felt through the soles of their feet as they stood upon the deck. They were not lost. They were simply moving through a home that spanned a third of the planet's surface. The vessel that carried them into the unknown was the pahi, a magnificent double-hulled voyaging canoe, carved from the massive trunks of sacred trees. These ships were marvels of ancient engineering, lashed together with miles of hand-braided coconut fibre cordage, which allowed the hulls to flex and move with the rhythm of the waves rather than snapping against them. Their sails, woven from the leaves of the pandanus, caught the trade winds with a grace that modern sailors still study with reverence. These were not mere boats. They were floating villages, carrying families, livestock, and the precious canoe plants, like taro and breadfruit, that would sustain them on new shores. The pahi was resilient, stable, and capable of weathering storms that would have foundered the heavy, rigid ships of later European explorers. It was on these decks that the dream of the South first took shape, a whisper of a world where the water turned to stone and the air bit at the skin like 1,000 needles. There is a deep cultural drive within the Polynesian spirit to seek out the limits of the world, a concept known as Te Tai-uka-a-pia, or the distant horizon. In the oral traditions of the Maori and other island nations, stories persist of a legendary navigator named Ui-te-Rangiora. Somewhere around the year 650, long before the first Viking stepped onto the shores of North America, it is said that he steered his vessel, the Te Tai-uka-a-pia, deep into the southern reaches of the world. He was searching for a place of wonder and terror, a realm he called Te Tai-uka-a-pia. In the ancient tongue, this translates to the frozen sea of arrowroot. To a person who had spent their entire life in the humid warmth of the tropics, the sight of pack ice and icebergs would have been utterly alien. The white, jagged floes, bobbing in the dark water, resembled the scraped and processed tubers of the arrowroot plant, a familiar substance used to describe a phenomenon that defied all previous experience. Imagine the silence of that southern world, broken only by the groaning of the ice and the breath of whales. The sunlight there is thin and silver, casting long, distorted shadows across a landscape of shifting white. As the pahi drifted through the mist, the voyagers would have seen the shining rocks that grew out of the sea, icebergs towering hundreds of feet into the air, glowing with an inner sapphire light. Mainstream archaeology has often been hesitant to accept these oral histories as literal truth, preferring to wait for the hard evidence of radiocarbon dating, the scientific process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic material. Yet, the physical world is beginning to yield secrets that align with the old songs. On the Sub-Antarctic islands, such as the Auckland Islands and Norfolk Island, researchers have uncovered the remains of temporary settlements, earth ovens, stone tools, and the bones of seals that bear the unmistakable marks of human butchery. These sites, found in the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris that act as a timeline of the earth, suggest that the Polynesians were not just accidental visitors, they were systematic explorers pushing further south than any human had ever dared, perhaps reaching the very edge of the Antarctic ice shelf itself. This drive to find Te Tai-uka-a-pia was not born of necessity alone, but of a profound curiosity about the nature of the great ocean of Kiwa. The Wayfinders were philosophers of the horizon. They understood that the world was vast and that the white foam of the south held its own mana or spiritual power. They moved through the cold with a quiet dignity, wrapped in cloaks of woven fibre and skin, their eyes fixed on the Southern Cross as it climbed higher into the velvet sky. As the years passed, the memory of these voyages became woven into the fabric of their identity, a reminder that their ancestors had looked into the abyss of the frozen south and had not blinked. We often think of the discovery of Antarctica as a triumph of the industrial age, a feat of steam and steel and Victorian endurance. But if we listen to the echoes of the past, we might hear the rhythmic dip of a paddle and the creak of braided rope. We might see the silhouette of a pahi against the glow of the Aurora Australis, its crew watching the sea turn to arrowroot as they navigated the edges of a continent that did not yet have a name on any Western map. The mystery of the loneliest continent is not a void, but a crowded space, filled with the ghosts of those who travelled by the stars and the swell. They were the first to touch the silence, the first to witness the slow, grinding dance of the ice. And their presence reminds us that the history of our world is far older and far more connected than we have been taught to believe. As we contemplate these ancient journeys, we must ask ourselves how much more lies buried beneath the permafrost or hidden in the depths of the Southern Ocean. The ice is a preservationist, holding on to the fragments of time with a cold, unyielding grip. Beneath the layers of snow, there may be more than just geological records. There may be the discarded tools of a people who saw the end of the world and chose to sail toward it anyway. The transition from the emerald lagoons of the north to the obsidian waters of the south was a journey across the very boundaries of the known universe. And so, we continue to look back, searching for the flickering shadows of the wayfinders in the mist, wondering what other secrets the frozen sea is still waiting to reveal. In the quiet oral archives of the Cook Islands, there is a name that carries the weight of 1,000 years, Ui-te-Rangiora. Long before the iron-hulled ships of the 18th century carved their names into the history books, the voyagers of the 7th century were already speaking of a world where the water turned to stone. The traditions of Rarotonga tell us of a navigator who looked past the familiar constellations of the tropical night and felt the pull of the southern void. He did not sail with the backing of an empire or the precision of a sextant, but with a knowledge of the stars and the swells that had been passed down through generations. A lineage of wayfinders who understood that the ocean was not a barrier, but a highway. As Ui-te-Rangiora steered his great voyaging canoe, the Te Tai-uka-a-pia, further south than any man had ever dared, the world began to transform in ways that must have felt like a slow descent into a dream. The warm, salt spray winds of the Pacific grew sharp and biting, carrying a chill that no woven cloak could fully repel. The very colour of the sea shifted from a vibrant turquoise to a deep, bruised indigo, and then to a black so profound it seemed to swallow the light. It is in this transition that we find the most haunting descriptions preserved in the chants of his people. The oral records speak of the Tai-uka-a-pia, a term that translates to a sea-like scraped arrowroot. To those who lived in the islands, arrowroot was a staple, a white, powdery substance that, when mixed with water, becomes a thick, pale slurry. To see the ocean itself take on this texture was to witness the impossible. The legends describe white rocks that grew out of the water, towering structures that shimmered with an unnatural light even under the overcast skies of the far south. To a modern ear, we recognize these as icebergs, but to a sailor from the 7th century, they were mountains that floated, silent, drifting giants that threatened to crush a wooden hull with a single indifferent movement. The voyagers spoke of the bull kelp hair that waved beneath the surface of the freezing waves, long dark strands of vegetation that seemed to reach up from the depths like the tresses of a submerged deity. In the high latitudes, the giant bull kelp grows in thick, tangled forests, its leathery fronds swaying in the surge of the Southern Ocean. For the crew of the Te Tai-uka-a-pia, these sightings were more than just biological curiosities. They were signs that they had crossed a threshold into a realm where the laws of nature had been rewritten. We must pause to consider the sheer psychological courage required to continue such a journey. In the 7th century, the world was often perceived as a series of concentric circles of safety, with the home fire at the center and the unknown terrors of the horizon at the edge. To sail south was to move away from the light of the sun, to watch the familiar stars of the northern sky dip below the horizon one by one, until even the Southern Cross hung strangely in the firmament. There was no guarantee of return, no map to follow, and no shore in sight. And yet, the oral traditions do not speak of fear, but of a profound curiosity, a drive to see what lay at the very end of the world. The skeptics of the 19th and 20th centuries often dismissed these stories as mere myths, poetic exaggerations of a people who never truly left the tropics. They argued that a wooden canoe, held together by sennit lashings and powered by woven sails, could never survive the fury of the roaring 40s or the furious 50s, those belts of wind that circle the bottom of the globe with unrelenting violence. But as our understanding of Polynesian navigation has deepened, the myth has begun to look more like a forgotten reality. We now know that these vessels were masterpieces of engineering, capable of riding the swells with a flexibility that rigid European ships lacked. The Wayfinders did not fight the ocean, they moved with it, reading the subtle changes in the water's temperature and the flight patterns of birds to find their way through the mist. As the years passed and the story of Ui-te-Rangiora was told and retold in the longhouses of Rarotonga, the details remained remarkably consistent. They spoke of a place of bitter cold, a concept that would have been entirely foreign to someone living in the perpetual summer of the Cook Islands. They described the shining land where the sun did not set, or where it disappeared for days on end, leaving the world in a twilight of ice and shadow. These are not the inventions of a tropical imagination. They are the observations of witnesses. They are the echoes of a time when the human spirit was not yet confined by the borders of maps or the limitations of what was deemed possible by distant academics. The journey of the Te Tai-uka-a-pia represents a bridge between two worlds, the lush, green islands of the north and the white, silent expanse of the south. It reminds us that history is not always written in ink. Sometimes it is carried in the rhythm of a chant or in the specific vocabulary used to describe the texture of a frozen sea. When we look at the modern maps of Antarctica, with their scientific bases and charted coastlines, we are seeing the world through a narrow lens. We are forgetting the centuries during which the loneliest continent was not a blank space, but a destination for those brave enough to seek it. In the silence of the Antarctic night, it is easy to imagine the ghostly silhouette of a double-hulled canoe slipping through the ice floes. The crew would have been silent, their breath blooming in the air like small white clouds, their eyes wide as they beheld the jagged peaks of the frozen continent rising out of the mist. They would have seen the penguins, those strange flightless birds that stood like sentinels on the ice, and the seals that basked in the pale, cold sun. They were the first to witness the scraped arrowroot of the sea, the first to touch the white rocks that floated, and perhaps the first to realize that the earth did not end in fire, but in ice. As we move forward in our exploration of this frozen history, we must ask ourselves how many other stories have been lost to the wind and the waves. The legend of Ui-te-Rangiora is a rare fragment, a survival of a maritime culture that once spanned the greatest ocean on Earth. It challenges the traditional timeline of discovery and forces us to reconsider the capabilities of ancient peoples. It suggests that the age of discovery did not begin in the ports of Europe, but in the lagoons of the Pacific, driven by a desire to know the unknown that is as old as humanity itself. The transition from the oral traditions to the physical evidence is a path fraught with difficulty. The sea is a vast graveyard, and the ice of Antarctica is a restless, moving sheet that grinds everything in its path to dust. Finding the physical remains of a 7th century voyage is a task that borders on the impossible. And yet, the clues are there, in the shared linguistics of the southern islands, in the genetic markers that trace the movement of people across the deep blue, and in the persistent, haunting memory of a land of ice that exists in the heart of a tropical culture. And so, we sit with the image of the navigator, standing at the prow of his vessel as the first icebergs appear on the horizon. He is a man caught between two eras, the world he knew and the world he discovered. His journey was a testament to the fact that the horizon is never a wall, but a doorway. As we listen to the wind howl across the southern wastes today, we are listening to the same sound that greeted Ui-te-Rangiora over 1,000 years ago. It is a sound of immense loneliness, but also of immense possibility. A reminder that even in the coldest, most desolate corners of our planet, the human spirit has already left its mark. The ice may be thick and the history may be buried, but the story of the Wayfinders continues to drift through the ages, waiting for us to finally hear what the silence is trying to tell us. Consider for a moment the surface of the ocean, not as a barrier, but as a manuscript written in a language we have largely forgotten how to read. To the modern mind, the open sea is a void, a blue expanse of nothingness that must be crossed as quickly as possible. But for the ancient navigators of the Pacific, the water was alive with information, a complex web of signals that whispered secrets of what lay beyond the curve of the earth. They did not possess the magnetic compass or the sextant, yet they possessed a clarity of vision that allowed them to see through the mist of distance. They looked to the sky, not as a distant ceiling, but as a living map, a celestial grid that moved in perfect, predictable harmony with the seasons. The Wayfinders relied heavily on what they called star paths. These were not singular points of light, but successions of stars that rose and set at the same points on the horizon. By keeping their vessel aligned with a specific star as it climbed into the velvet dark, a navigator could maintain a straight line across thousands of miles of trackless water. When that star rose too high to be useful, they would wait for the next one in the sequence to emerge from the sea. A silent baton passed from one light to another. In the deep south, far beyond the familiar islands of the tropics, the sky began to change. The Great Bear and the North Star vanished entirely, replaced by a constellation that would become the ultimate guide for those venturing into the unknown. The Southern Cross. It hung there, a tilted diamond of light, its long axis pointing like a steady finger toward the celestial South Pole. To follow it was to commit oneself to the cold, to move deeper into the shadows of the world where the nights grew longer and the air turned brittle with frost. But the stars were only half of the story, for the sky can be obscured by clouds and the thick, grey veils of southern storms. When the lights above failed, the ancient sailors looked down at the water itself. They practiced a lost art of reading the swells, sensing the subtle patterns of the deep-sea waves that travel for thousands of miles across the Pacific. These waves are born from distant winds, and they move with a rhythmic consistency that a trained navigator can feel through the hull of a canoe, even in total darkness. They were looking for something specific, something the wayfinders called refracted waves. When a great ocean swell hits a landmass, even a landmass that is still hundreds of miles over the horizon, it does not simply stop. It bounces back, or it bends around the obstacle, creating a secondary pattern of interference. Imagine a ripple in a pond hitting a stone. The way the water crinkles and reflects back creates a unique signature. To a navigator lying in the bottom of a vessel, feeling the pitch and roll with their entire body, these reflected waves were as clear as a lighthouse. They could detect the presence of land by the way the water felt, sensing the echo of a continent long before the first glimpse of ice appeared on the horizon. It is a form of sensory archaeology, a way of interacting with the physical world that requires a level of patience and attunement that we can scarcely imagine today. They were listening to the heartbeat of the ocean, waiting for the slight skip in rhythm that signaled the presence of something solid in the vast, liquid dark. As they moved further south, into the latitudes where the water begins to take on the color of lead, they found other companions to guide their way. They watched the birds. The Pacific is a highway for migratory species, creatures that possess an innate biological map of the globe. The wayfinders knew that certain birds, like the bar-tailed godwit or the sooty shearwater, do not fly aimlessly. They are travelers with a destination. By observing the flight paths of these birds at dawn and dusk, the navigators could determine the direction of distant nesting grounds. If a bird was seen carrying a fish back toward the horizon, it meant land was near. If it flew with an empty beak, it was heading out to hunt. In these southern reaches, they would have encountered the great albatross, a bird that seems to belong more to the wind than to the earth. They would have seen the white terns and the petrels, and perhaps, as they pushed even further, they noticed a change in the very nature of the life around them. They were following a trail of breadcrumbs left by the natural world, a path marked by the beating of wings and the shifting of currents. It was a journey of incredible intuition, a slow, deliberate peeling back of the layers of the map. They were not just sailing, they were participating in the environment, moving in a state of constant observation, where every ripple, every gust of wind, and every distant cry of a bird was a piece of a puzzle that had been being assembled for generations. There is a profound mystery in how these early explorers managed to survive the transition from the warm, turquoise waters of the Central Pacific to the brutal, unforgiving gales of the Southern Ocean. The temperature drops with a terrifying speed once you pass the subtropical convergence. The air becomes heavy with moisture, and the spray from the waves begins to bite at the skin. Yet, the evidence suggests they did not turn back. They navigated by the Te Tai-uka-a-pia, a phenomenon of underwater lightning, faint, streaking flashes of bioluminescence that some navigators claim point toward land. They moved through a world of shadows and light, guided by a sophisticated understanding of the Earth's natural systems that science is only now beginning to fully appreciate. We must ask ourselves what it felt like to be on the deck of a voyaging canoe when the first signs of the frozen sea appeared. It wouldn't have been a sudden wall of ice, but rather a subtle change in the atmosphere. The smell of the salt changes when it is near ice. It becomes crisper, cleaner, stripped of the organic scents of the tropics. Then, perhaps, the appearance of the shining mountains mentioned in the oral traditions. The massive, tabular icebergs that drift like ghost ships through the southern mists. These were the first cathedrals they encountered, towering structures of white and deep ancient blue, carved by the waves into fantastic shapes. To an explorer from an island of palms and volcanic stone, these icebergs must have seemed like something from another realm, a manifestation of the spirits of the deep. The Wayfinders were masters of the long view. They understood that time and distance are not enemies to be conquered, but dimensions to be inhabited. Their navigation was a form of meditation, a continuous dialogue between the human mind and the vast, indifferent forces of the planet. As they looked up at the Southern Cross, hanging steady amidst the swirling clouds of the Antarctic fringe, they were witnessing the same stars that had guided their ancestors across the widest ocean on Earth. The distance between the known and the unknown was bridged not by iron or steam, but by the strength of memory and the sharpness of the senses. They were moving through a landscape of deep time, where the past and the future merged into a single, eternal present, dictated by the rhythm of the swells and the silent rotation of the heavens. And so, the voyage continued, driven by a curiosity that seems to be woven into the very fabric of our species. They were seeking the end of the world, or perhaps the beginning of a new one, in the silence of the southern latitudes, where the only sound is the groan of the hull and the whistle of the wind through the rigging. The wayfinders found something that cannot be measured by instruments. They found a connection to the primary forces of the earth, a realization that we are never truly lost as long as we know how to look at the stars and feel the movement of the water beneath us. The ice was waiting, a silent sentinel at the bottom of the world, but the path to it had already been written in the waves, waiting for the one who had the patience to read it. Language is a vessel, a sturdy craft that carries the weight of a people's memory across the vast expanses of time, often preserving truths that the physical world has tried to erode. In the oral traditions of the Maori, there exists a name that shimmers with a cold, ethereal light. Te Tai-uka-a-pia. To the casual observer, it is merely a beautiful arrangement of sounds, but to those who understand the deep roots of the tongue, it is a map drawn in phonetics. It translates most commonly to the Sea of Arrowroot, a name that feels strangely out of place in the lush green warmth of the Polynesian islands. Arrowroot, when scraped and prepared, creates a fine white granular substance, a powder that shifts and clumps in a way that mirrors something far more crystalline and dangerous. As we look closer at these linguistic fragments, we find ourselves standing on the edge of a frozen revelation. The Maori ancestors did not have a word for ice in the way a continental European might understand it, having lived for generations in the embrace of the Pacific's temperate currents. And yet, their stories speak of a place where the mountains grow directly out of the water, where the surface of the sea is covered in white shavings, and where the very air turns into a solid that bites at the skin. By comparing the visual properties of arrowroot to the jagged, shifting flows of the Southern Ocean, we begin to see a poetic accuracy that defies the limitations of their tropical vocabulary. It is a form of descriptive archaeology, a way of excavating the past through the words that remain after the physical evidence has been swallowed by the deep. The significance of the Sea of Arrowroot goes beyond simple metaphor. In the ancient chants, this realm is described as a place of absolute stillness and terrifying power, where the sun behaves in ways that contradict the laws of the known world. The linguistic analysis reveals terms for the frozen sea and the place where the sun hides, suggesting an encounter with the high latitudes that predates the arrival of European steel by nearly 1,000 years. These are not the vague myths of a people dreaming of distant lands. They are the specific technical observations of navigators who have seen the horizon turn white and felt the terrifying silence of the ice shelf. When we align these oral histories with modern oceanographic data, the coincidence becomes a haunting certainty. Scientists today use satellite imagery and deep-sea sensors to map the movement of the Antarctic circumpolar current, a massive, swirling ring of water that acts as a barrier between the warmth of the north and the frigid grip of the south. This current is a chaotic frontier of storms and towering waves, yet the Maori accounts speak of finding a path through the shrieking winds to reach a zone of eerie calm where the water becomes thick and sluggish. This perfectly describes the transition from the turbulent Southern Ocean into the shelter of the pack ice, where the swells are dampened by the weight of the floes and the world becomes a muffled white cathedral. It is here that we must consider the concept of deep time, the idea that human history is not a straight line of progress, but a series of peaks and valleys where knowledge is gained, lost, and then rediscovered centuries later. The modern era often views the discovery of Antarctica as a triumph of 19th century industrial might, of wooden ships reinforced with iron and men clad in heavy wool. But the Maori stories suggest a different kind of triumph, one of supreme environmental awareness and the sheer bravery of venturing into the unknown in a double-hulled waka, guided only by the stars and the subtle changes in the colour of the water. The linguistic evidence acts as a bridge between the subjective experience of the voyager and the objective reality of the Antarctic landscape. Terms for the rocks that grow from the sky likely refer to the massive icebergs that carve from the shelves, great shimmering monoliths that would have appeared as floating mountains to a sailor from the north. The ancient voyagers described the hair of the goddess flowing in the water, which modern researchers believe refers to certain types of kelp, or perhaps the long, stringy formations of slush ice that appear at the beginning of the southern winter. Each word is a breadcrumb, leading us further away from the safety of the known world and deeper into the mystery of who truly saw the white continent first. Meanwhile, the ocean itself holds secrets that are only now beginning to be whispered back to us. Oceanography tells us that the 10th and 11th centuries were a period of relative climatic stability, a time when the currents may have been more predictable, perhaps opening a window for a truly daring crew to push further south than anyone had ever dreamed. If a navigator like the legendary Ui-te-Rangiora truly steered his vessel into the Sea of Arrowroot around the year 650, he would have encountered a world that was both beautiful and lethal. The geological record confirms that the ice shelves were active and the sea ice was present, creating the exact conditions described in the Maori chants. As the years passed and these stories were handed down through the generations, they became woven into the spiritual fabric of the people. The ice was not just a physical barrier, it was a boundary between the world of the living and the primordial forces of the earth. The Maori did not seek to conquer the ice or to plant a flag in its frozen soil. They sought to understand its place in the great harmony of the universe. This perspective is perhaps why mainstream science was so slow to recognize these accounts, because they were recorded in the language of song and genealogy rather than the dry prose of a captain's log. Yet, as we refine our understanding of historical linguistics, we find that the Maori were using a highly sophisticated system of classification to describe an environment they should, by all rights, have known nothing about. We must ask ourselves, what else has been lost in the gaps between cultures? What other great discoveries lie hidden in the metaphors of ancient tongues? The Sea of Arrowroot remains a haunting reminder that the map of the world was never truly blank. It was always filled with the names given by those who had the courage to look beyond the horizon and the wisdom to remember what they found. The ice was never lonely. It was simply waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to the stories that had already been told in the warmth of the communal fires 1,000 miles away. The connection between the Maori and the far south is a testament to the endurance of memory. Even as the physical evidence of such voyages might be buried under miles of shifting ice or lost in the crushing depths of the Southern Ocean, the words remain. They are a form of intangible stratigraphy, layers of meaning piled one on top of the other, waiting for someone to peel them back and reveal the truth beneath.
the white shavings of the arrowroot, the mountains that pierce the clouds, and the darkness that lasts for days. These are not the inventions of a creative mind, but the echoes of a cold reality that was witnessed and recorded in the only way the voyagers knew how. And so we sit with the realization that the history of exploration is much older and much more complex than our textbooks suggest. The loneliest continent was reached not by those seeking to exploit it, but by those who followed the stars into the heart of the mystery. The Maori connection to Te Tai-uka-a-pia is a shimmering thread in the tapestry of human endeavor, a reminder that even in the most remote corners of the earth, we have never been truly alone. The ice remembers the keels of the ancient ships, and the wind still carries the faint, ghostly echoes of the chants that were sung to keep the cold at bay.
To understand how a wooden hull could survive such a journey, we must look not at the land, but at the water, specifically that great swirling engine of the world known as the Antarctic circumpolar current. It is a liquid wall, a massive clockwise rotation of cold, dense brine that encircles the frozen continent like a protective moat. For centuries, modern oceanographers believed this current was an impassable frontier for any vessel not forged of steel and powered by steam. It is the only current that flows entirely around the globe, unimpeded by any landmass, creating a biological and physical boundary that separates the warmth of the north from the eternal winter of the south. And yet, the ocean is never a static thing. It breathes, it pulses, and it shifts with the seasons. While the main body of the current moves with terrifying force, it is not a smooth ribbon of water. Instead, it is a chaotic tapestry of eddies, giant swirling gyres that break away from the primary flow like spinning gears. These eddies can be hundreds of miles wide, acting as temporary bridges across the void. To an ancient navigator, one who possessed a deep intuitive understanding of the water's color and the way the waves broke against the horizon, these spinning pools of water were not obstacles, but opportunities. They were the hidden pathways of the sea, moving southwards in slow, rhythmic pulses that could carry a skilled sailor deep into the forbidden latitudes before the currents shifted once more. As a vessel moves south from the temperate waters of the Pacific, the air begins to change. It grows heavy and sharp, carrying the scent of ancient ice and the metallic tang of the deep. The sailors would have first encountered the roaring 40s, a belt of wind between the 40-degree and 50-degree latitudes where the air screams through the rigging with a relentless, haunting moan. There is no land here to break the wind's spirit, and so it gathers strength across thousands of miles of open water, building waves that rise like obsidian mountains. To survive here in a double-hulled voyaging canoe, or perhaps a vessel whose design has been lost to the fog of time, required more than just luck. It required a mastery of fluid dynamics that we are only just beginning to appreciate. The physical toll of these latitudes is immense, a grinding exhaustion that settles into the marrow of the bones. The furious 50s follow the 40s, where the cold becomes a physical weight, pressing down on the chest and freezing the spray into jagged needles of ice before it even hits the deck. The wood of the ship groans under the stress, the fibers stretching and contracting in the frigid brine. We must imagine the endurance of those on board, huddled beneath skins and woven fibers, their eyes stinging from the salt, watching the stars for any sign of a break in the clouds. They were moving through a realm where time feels elongated, where the grey sky bleeds into the grey sea until there is no horizon, only a vast, cold infinity. In these extreme conditions, the concept of a linear voyage begins to dissolve. The ancient mariners likely utilized the seasonal variations in the ice and wind, waiting for those rare windows of clarity when the great southern engine slowed its pace. There is a specific phenomenon known as the Antarctic divergence, where the cold, deep waters rise to the surface, bringing with them a wealth of nutrients and a change in the sea's temperature. A navigator tuned to the subtle shifts of the environment would feel this change. A slight softening of the water's texture, a different pattern in the swell. By hitching their fate to these seasonal eddies, they could find themselves pulled further south than any map of the era would dare to suggest. We often think of the ocean as a barrier, a void that separates civilizations, but to the ancients it was a highway, albeit one that demanded a terrible price for passage. The sheer energy required to cross the circumpolar current is staggering, and yet the evidence suggests that the boundary was breached. Perhaps it was a deliberate expedition, a quest for the source of the cold winds that brought the seasonal rains, or perhaps it was a group of explorers driven off course by a storm of such magnitude that they had no choice but to run before the wind deeper and deeper into the white silence. The roaring 40s and the furious 50s do not just test the strength of a ship, they test the limits of human psychology. In the constant gloom of the southern autumn, the mind begins to wander, finding shapes in the mist and voices in the howling gale. The sailors would have seen the great albatrosses, those lonely wanderers of the high seas, following them like silent sentinels, their wings spanning 11 feet as they glided effortlessly over the crests of the waves. To the ancients, these birds were often seen as the spirits of ancestors or guardians of the deep, and their presence might have been the only thing that kept despair at bay as the temperature plummeted. As the years passed and the memory of these voyages faded into legend, the physical evidence of the ships would have been reclaimed by the sea. Wood, fibre and bone do not last long in the abrasive, salt-heavy environment of the sub-Antarctic islands, yet the currents remain, still churning, still spinning their complex webs of water. When we look at the sophisticated models of ocean circulation today, we see the same patterns that would have greeted those early explorers. The same eddies, the same thermal fronts, the same invisible doorways. The mystery lies in the gap between what we believe was possible and what the oral traditions tell us occurred. Mainstream science often relies on the absence of physical artifacts to dismiss these early arrivals, but in the shifting world of the Southern Ocean, the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence. The sea is a master of erasure. It grinds stone to sand and timber to pulp. What remains is the knowledge of the currents, a silent roadmap written in the movement of the water itself. If the Maori and their predecessors reached the ice, they did so by dancing with the ocean's greatest forces, navigating the very currents that were supposed to keep them away. As the vessel drifts further south, past the screaming 60s and into the realm of the icebergs, the character of the journey changes again. The chaos of the wind-swept waves gives way to a strange, terrifying stillness. The water becomes viscous, thickened by slush and pancake ice, and the only sound is the rhythmic grinding of the floes against one another. It is here, in this transition zone, that the true scale of the achievement becomes clear. To have crossed the most violent seas on earth in a craft of wood and cord is a feat that defies our modern understanding of ancient technology. It suggests a relationship with the natural world that was not based on conquest, but on a deep, resonant harmony, a way of listening to the water until it told you where it wanted to go. The Roaring Forties were not just a hurdle to be cleared. They were a gateway into a different world, a place where the rules of the Northern Hemisphere no longer applied. In this space the stars move differently, the light behaves in strange, prismatic ways, and the very air feels as though it belongs to another epoch of the Earth's history. The ancient navigators who braved these currents were entering a cathedral of ice and wind, a place where the deep time of the planet is laid bare. And as we trace the paths of those ancient eddies through the modern lens of science, we begin to see the faint outlines of their wake. A shimmering path through the cold, leading us toward a history that has been hidden beneath the waves for 1,000 years. A single, microscopic grain of pollen, trapped within a layer of ancient silt, can hold the weight of a forgotten voyage. It is a silent witness to a story that the ice and the wind have tried to erase. When we look at the Sub-Antarctic islands, those lonely, jagged sentinels like the Auckland Islands or the Snares, we see a landscape that appears untouched by human hands until the arrival of European sealers in the 19th century. Yet, beneath the moss and the peat, the earth tells a different story. In the quiet darkness of the soil, researchers have uncovered traces of charcoal, tiny, jagged fragments of burnt wood that do not belong to the natural order of these islands. In a place where lightning is a rarity and the damp, salt-heavy air usually prevents the spread of natural wildfires, these layers of carbonized wood suggest a deliberate flame. They suggest a hearth. The analysis of this charcoal, a process known as stratigraphy, where scientists study the layers of the earth like pages in a book, reveals that these fires were burning long before the first recorded sightings of the southern lands. These are the embers of a people who moved with the seasons and the stars. They were not merely lost explorers, but masters of the sea, who brought the warmth of their culture to the very edge of the world. As the researchers dug deeper, they found that these charcoal traces were often accompanied by the sudden appearance of certain pollens, plants that were not native to these freezing latitudes, but were brought there by design. Among these botanical mysteries is the presence of the kumara, the sweet potato. For decades, the sweet potato has been a silent enigma in the history of the Pacific. It is a plant native to the warm tropical soils of South America, yet it was found growing across the vast expanse of Polynesia long before any European ship crossed the Pacific. Its DNA tells a story of a journey across thousands of miles of open water, a journey that could only have been made by human hands. To find the genetic signature of the kumara in the southern reaches, near the gateway to the Antarctic, is to find the fingerprint of a civilization that viewed the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. It suggests that the navigators were carrying their most precious cargo with them, testing the soil of every new land they encountered, searching for a place where their lifeblood could take root. But the evidence does not stop with the flora. It extends to the creatures that followed in the wake of the great outriggers. In the quiet, damp caves and the sheltered coves of the southern islands, the earth has yielded the bones of the kuri, the Polynesian dog. These were not the wild predators of the continents, but companions, domesticated animals that relied on humans for their survival. To find their remains on islands so close to the Antarctic Circle is to realize that these voyages were not frantic flights for survival, but organized domestic migrations. The kuri were more than just animals. They were a part of the social fabric of the voyagers, providing warmth, companionship, and a link to the homes they had left behind. Alongside the dog came a less welcome traveler, the Pacific rat, or kiore. While often viewed as a stowaway, the presence of the kiore in the archaeological record is a powerful indicator of human arrival. They do not swim across oceans, they ride in the hulls of ships. When we find their tiny, fragile bones in the deep layers of sub-Antarctic soil, dated by radiocarbon techniques to centuries before the modern era, we are looking at the biological footprint of a landing. Radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, places these creatures on the islands during a window of time when the world was supposed to be empty of human life. These small bones are the echoes of a bustling camp, the sound of wood being hewn, the smell of roasting meat, and the chatter of a people who had found a temporary home in the shadow of the ice. We must wonder what these travellers thought as they sat by their fires on the Auckland Islands, looking out across the grey, churning waters toward the south. They would have seen the shifting lights of the aurora Australis dancing across the heavens, a celestial fire that mirrored their own. They would have felt the air grow thinner and colder with every passing week. The presence of their animals and their plants suggests a desire to stay, to colonize, to weave these distant islands into the tapestry of their world. But the environment was harsh. The Kumara, so used to the volcanic warmth of the north, would have struggled in the acidic, waterlogged soil. The dogs would have huddled together against the biting gales, and yet the charcoal layers persist. They appear and disappear through the centuries, suggesting a cycle of arrival and departure, a seasonal rhythm where the great navigators returned to these southern outposts year after year. Perhaps they used them as base camps for further exploration, staging grounds for the final push into the white unknown. The charcoal is not just a sign of fire, it is a sign of persistence. It is the mark of a species that refuses to be bounded by the limits of the map. In the silence of the laboratory, as scientists peer through microscopes at these fragments of carbon and bone, the vast, empty history of the Antarctic begins to fill with shadows. We see the outlines of a maritime empire that did not leave behind stone monuments or written records, but instead left its legacy in the very biology of the Earth. The deep time of the Sub-Antarctic is not a vacuum. It is a crowded space, filled with the ghosts of dogs barking at the southern seals and the smell of smoke drifting over the kelp forests. As we contemplate these findings, we are forced to ask how much more remains hidden. How many other islands hold the DNA of the tropics in their frozen soil? How many more hearths lie buried beneath the peat, waiting for a stray shovel to bring their light back into the world? The mystery of the loneliest continent is no longer just a question of who saw the ice first, but a question of who lived in its shadow. The biological traces are the breadcrumbs of a journey that spanned the globe, a testament to a time when the world was smaller because the courage of its people was so much larger. As the years pass and the ice continues to shift, revealing more of the land that has been hidden for millennia, we may find that these charcoal traces are merely the beginning. We may find that the Southern Ocean was once a place of vibrant activity, a frontier where the bravest souls of the Pacific tested their limits against the absolute zero of the world, the Kumara, the Kuri, and the charcoal. They are the three threads of a cord that pulls us back through time, connecting us to a moment when the first human eyes looked south and saw not a void, but a challenge. We are left to wander through these thoughts, much like the navigators wandered through the mists, guided by the faint, shimmering traces of those who went before, and the quiet, enduring presence of the life they brought with them into the cold. In the stillness of the sub-Antarctic night, if one listens closely enough, the wind seems to carry the faint crackle of a fire that was lit 1,000 years ago, a fire that refuses to go out as long as there are those who remember to look for its ashes. Deep beneath the peat and the tangled roots of the wind-swept Auckland Islands, there lies a layer of charcoal and bone that tells a story of survival at the edge of the known world. It is a thin, dark line in the stratigraphy, the layers of soil that serve as the Earth's own memory, marking a moment when the silence of these islands was broken by the sound of human voices and the steady crackle of wood being consumed by flame. To find these traces, one must travel nearly 500 kilometers south of New Zealand to a place where the Southern Ocean begins its relentless, icy surge toward the Antarctic Circle. These are the Sub-Antarctic Waystations, the lonely outposts of Enderby and Campbell Island, where the mists are so thick they seem to swallow the very concept of time. For centuries, mainstream history suggested these islands remained untouched until the arrival of European sealers in the early 19th century. But the Earth itself holds a different record. Beneath the surface, archaeologists have unearthed the unmistakable remains of Polynesian earth ovens known as umu, small circular pits lined with stones that still bear the scorch marks of intense heat. These were not the fires of a permanent colony. but the temporary hearths of long-distance voyagers who had mastered the currents of the great southern sea long before the first wooden ships of Europe ever sighted these shores. The presence of these ovens suggests a deliberate and calculated use of the islands as seasonal camps. Imagine for a moment the scene as it might have looked 700 or perhaps 1,000 years ago. A double-hulled voyaging canoe, carved from the great trees of a warmer northern island, pulls into the sheltered waters of Sandy Bay. The travellers are weary, their skin salt-crusted and their muscles aching from the constant battle against the swells. They do not find a paradise of palms and fruit, but a rugged landscape of basalt cliffs and stunted forests, where the wind never truly stops its mournful song. Yet they find life here in abundance. The beaches are crowded with New Zealand fur seals and the massive, lumbering forms of sea lions. The air is thick with the cries of yellow-eyed penguins and albatrosses nesting in the tussock grass. For a navigator who has spent weeks on the open water, these islands were not a wasteland, but a vital larder, a place to rest, to repair, and to gather the high-energy proteins required to survive in the ever-dropping temperatures of the south. As the years passed and the seasons turned, these voyagers returned again and again, leaving behind a subtle trail of their presence. In the dark soil of the Auckland Islands, researchers have used radiocarbon dating, a process that measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic matter, to confirm that these fires were burning as early as the 13th century. The stratigraphy reveals that these were not accidental fires, but organized sites where seals and penguins were hunted and prepared. The umu stones were carefully selected, heated until they glowed, and then placed in the pits to steam the meat of the sea dwellers. It was a technology of survival, portable and efficient, allowing these ancient explorers to carve out a living in a place where the frost begins to bite long before the sun goes down. One can almost see them huddled around the warmth of the stones, the steam rising into the cold air, while the Southern Cross hung low and bright in the sky above, a familiar guide in an increasingly unfamiliar sea. There is a profound, quiet mystery in the brevity of these visits. The archaeological evidence shows that while the Polynesians reached these islands and utilized them heavily, they did not stay forever. The Auckland and Campbell Islands sit in the path of the roaring 40s and the furious 50s, the powerful westerly winds that circle the globe unimpeded by land. Life here is a constant struggle against the elements. The soil is acidic, the light is fleeting, and the sea is a jealous master. Perhaps these islands were meant only as a bridge, a halfway point between the lush islands of the north and the great white silence that lay even further south. They were waystations in the truest sense, places to catch one's breath before pushing the boundaries of the world even further. One wonders what those early navigators thought as they looked toward the southern horizon, noticing how the water grew colder and the ice began to appear in the waves. Did they recognize the islands as the final stepping stones before the end of the world, or did they see them as the beginning of a vast, undiscovered country? Meanwhile, on Campbell Island, even further south and more isolated, the traces are even fainter, yet they persist. Here the landscape is dominated by giant herbs and the lonely, majestic presence of the southern royal albatross. To find human traces here is to realize the sheer scale of Polynesian ambition. To reach Campbell Island in a wooden vessel, guided by the stars and the flight patterns of birds, is a feat of navigation that defies easy explanation. The hunters who landed here would have found a world teeming with elephant seals, their blubber providing a precious source of fuel and warmth. The seasonal hunting of these animals was not merely a matter of convenience. It was a necessity for those who dared to probe the edges of the Antarctic convergence, where the warm northern waters meet the frigid currents of the deep south. This boundary is a place of immense biological productivity, where the churning waters bring nutrients to the surface, supporting a food chain that ends with the great predators of the ice. The silence that followed these early visits is perhaps as telling as the evidence of the visits themselves. Eventually, the fires in the Umu pits went out. The stones grew cold, and the peat began its slow, relentless crawl over the campsites, burying the charcoal and the discarded bones under meters of moss and earth. Why did they stop coming? Perhaps the climate shifted, the onset of the Little Ice Age making the southern voyages too perilous even for the greatest mariners the world had ever known. Or perhaps the islands had served their purpose, their secrets mapped and their resources noted in the oral traditions of the North, passed down through generations as stories of a cold, dark land where the sun barely rose and the sea was filled with monsters of ice. As we look back through the lens of deep time, these Sub-Antarctic Waystations serve as a reminder that the history of exploration is not a straight line, but a series of pulses, advances and retreats, discoveries and forgettings. The Auckland and Campbell Islands sit in the grey light of the Southern Ocean, holding their secrets close. They are the guardians of a forgotten chapter, a time when the loneliest continent was not quite so lonely, and the smoke of human fires drifted over the waves, signalling to the ice that someone was coming. The weight of these ages is felt in the very air of the islands, a heavy, damp presence that seems to vibrate with the echoes of the past. The evidence is there, written in the soot of the earth and the arrangement of the stones, waiting for those who are patient enough to listen to what the ground has to say. It tells of a people who did not fear the cold, but respected it. A people who saw the islands not as a destination, but as a doorway into the great, shimmering mystery of the South. Long before the first wooden hull ever crunched against the southern ice, there was a ghost in the minds of the ancients, a phantom land that existed simply because it had to. In the quiet libraries of Alexandria and the marble halls of Greece, philosophers looked at the world not just as a place to be mapped, but as a structure of perfect symmetry. They believed that if the world was a sphere, it required a counterweight. If the north was heavy with the continents of Europe and Asia, then the belly of the world must hold something equally vast to keep the earth from tipping into the void. They called this theoretical mirror to the Arctic the Antarcticos, the opposite of the bear. It was a land born of logic and geometry, a mathematical necessity that haunted the dreams of cartographers for over 2,000 years before a single human eye confirmed its existence. As the centuries drifted by like slow-moving clouds, this imagined continent began to take shape on the vellum pages of early maps. It was often labelled as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. To the medieval mind, this was not merely a blank space on a chart, but a lush and fertile territory, perhaps home to strange civilizations or creatures that defied the natural order of the north. The mapmakers of the Renaissance, working in the dim light of flickering candles, drew sprawling coastlines that reached up from the bottom of the world to touch the tips of South America and Africa. They were sketching a memory of a place they had never seen, guided by a deep-seated intuition that the Southern Ocean was not an endless waste of water, but a cradle for a hidden empire. Among these silent testaments of ink and parchment, one document stands out, casting a long and unsettling shadow over our understanding of history. In the year 1513, a Turkish admiral and cartographer named Piri Reis compiled a world map that continues to baffle scholars and dreamers alike. Painted on gazelle skin with meticulous detail, the map depicts the western coast of Africa, the eastern coast of South America, and, most controversially, a coastline that seems to trail off to the south, curving eastward in a way that many believe represents the northern shore of Antarctica. The mystery of the Piri Reis map lies not just in the presence of the land, but in its condition. The coastline it depicts is remarkably similar to the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, the shape of the continent as it appears beneath the ice, Modern science tells us that Antarctica has been encased in a frozen shroud for millions of years, yet here, on a map drawn centuries before the official discovery of the continent, we see a land that appears to be free of ice, showing bays, rivers, and mountain ranges that are currently buried under miles of solid frost. It forces us to wonder if the Admiral was working from much older source maps, fragments of knowledge preserved from a time when the world looked very different, perhaps from a civilization that flourished during the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change and melting ice that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. The skeptics suggest that the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map is merely a distorted version of the South American coast, bent to fit the shape of the animal skin it was drawn upon. They argue that the similarities to Antarctica are nothing more than a coincidence, a trick of the eye fueled by our desire to find lost secrets in the past. And yet, when one looks at the precision of the other geographical features on the map, the coincidence feels heavy, almost deliberate. It is as if we are looking at a palimpsest, a document where the original writing has been scraped away, but remains visible in the right light, hinting at a deep history of seafaring and exploration that predates our written records by millennia. We must consider the possibility that the ancients knew the world better than we give them credit for. The Greeks, the Phoenicians, and even the mysterious sea peoples of the Bronze Age may have possessed a sophisticated understanding of global geography that was lost during the collapse of their civilizations. To them, the Antarcticos was not a myth, but a destination. As the years passed and the great libraries burned, as the knowledge of the stars and the currents faded into superstition, the maps remained, quiet messengers from a forgotten epoch. They suggest a world that was once connected by vast maritime networks, where the great southern continent was not a frozen tomb, but a frontier. Imagine a navigator standing on the deck of a reed ship or a cedar galley, watching the stars shift in a way that no one in the north had ever seen. The air grows colder, the wind carries the scent of ancient moss and damp stone, and ahead, a line of blue mountains rises from the sea. This is the world of the deep past, a world where the boundaries of the known and the unknown were constantly shifting. The Piri Reis map, with its strange ice-free mountains, serves as a bridge into this twilight era. It asks us to look past the stratigraphy, the layers of earth and ice that archaeologists use to date the passing of time, and to see the world as a living, breathing entity that has forgotten more than we will ever know. There is a certain weight to this realization, a feeling of insignificance when faced with the vastness of deep time. We like to believe that we are the first to conquer the elements, the first to chart the ends of the earth. But the maps suggest otherwise. They suggest that we are merely rediscovering a path that was walked by shadows long ago. The controversy of the southern coastline is not just a debate about ink and parchment. It is a question of our own identity. Are we the pinnacle of human achievement, or are we simply the latest inhabitants of a world that has seen greatness rise and fall in cycles we cannot yet comprehend? As we ponder the curves of the Piri Reis map, we are drawn into a patient mystery. We see the hand of a cartographer who claimed to have used 20 different source maps to create his masterpiece, including some that dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. Where did those maps come from? Who were the original surveyors who stood on those southern shores and measured the height of the peaks? The silence of the ice is the only answer we receive, but the maps remain, brittle and faded, whispering of a time when the loneliest continent was not so lonely after all. The concept of the Antarcticos was more than just a balance for the north. It was a symbol of the human urge to seek out the hidden. Even when the land was nothing more than a theory, it occupied a central place in the human psyche. It was the great reserve of the world, the final secret. And as we look back through the lens of these ancient charts,
we see that the history of Antarctica is not a straight line beginning in the 19th century, but a winding path that disappears into the mists of prehistory. It is a story told in fragments, in the alignment of a coastline, the curve of a mountain range, and the persistent belief that there is always something more, just beyond the horizon, waiting to be found in the deep, cold quiet of the south.
Imagine a scholar in a candlelit scriptorium during the Middle Ages leaning over a piece of vellum that feels as old as the earth itself. He is not drawing what he sees, but what he feels must be true. For centuries, a singular idea gripped the minds of the greatest thinkers in the West, an idea that the world was out of balance. They looked at the vast land masses of the North, Europe, Asia, and the sweeping reaches of Africa, and they felt a deep, unsettling symmetry. To their minds, the world was like a great ship, and if all the weight remained at the top, the vessel would surely capsize into the celestial void. And so they whispered of Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. It was a continent born of necessity, a philosophical anchor required to keep the spinning globe upright in the heavens. This was not a land of maps and measurements, but a land of pure theory. The ancient Greeks had first proposed it, and by the medieval era, it had become a foundational truth of the natural world. They believed that somewhere, far beyond the scorching heat of the equator, which they thought was a wall of fire impassable to mortal men, there lay a mirror to the north, a temperate, fertile, and massive realm that counterbalanced the weight of the known world. As the centuries drifted by, this imagined continent grew in the collective psyche, becoming a repository for every myth and every longing for a lost paradise. It was a place where the laws of nature might be different, where the seasons might run in reverse, and where the echoes of a golden age might still linger in the cool southern air. But while the philosophers of Europe were busy dreaming of cosmic balance and drawing speculative coastlines on maps made of sheepskin, another story was unfolding across the vast blue expanse of the Pacific. To the European mind, the ocean was a barrier, a terrifying edge of the world. But to the Polynesian navigators, the ocean was a highway. While the scholars in their stone cloisters debated the existence of a theoretical landmass to keep the earth from tilting, the people of the sea were already reading the language of the waves. They did not need a philosophical reason for a southern land to exist. They simply followed the flight of the birds, the taste of the salt, and the subtle shifts in the deep water swells that spoke of land hidden just over the curve of the horizon. There is a profound irony in this collision of perspectives. The European misconception was rooted in a desire for order, a belief that the universe was a mechanical clock that required a heavy weight at its base to function correctly. They envisioned a continent that was lush and teeming with life, perhaps even inhabited by strange, monstrous races or the descendants of lost biblical tribes. They were looking for a reflection of themselves, a grand stage for conquest and conversion. Yet the reality of the South was something far more silent and far more ancient than they could have ever imagined. While they drew their intricate imaginary maps, they were entirely unaware that the true southern land was not a fertile paradise, but a kingdom of ice, a continent that had been frozen in time for millions of years. The lived experience of the Polynesians stands in stark contrast to these European abstractions. Their knowledge was not found in books, but in the muscles and the memory of generations. They understood the concept of deep time through the genealogies of the stars. When the navigator Ui-te-Rangiora sailed south in the 7th century, he wasn't looking for a way to balance the earth. He was following the call of the unknown, pushed by a curiosity that is perhaps the most fundamental human trait. The oral traditions tell of a place he called Te Tai-uka-a-pia, a frozen sea that looked like scraped arrowroot. This was not a theoretical landmass meant to satisfy a mathematical equation. This was a physical encounter with the sublime, a moment where the warmth of the human spirit met the absolute zero of the Antarctic fringe. As the years passed, the European obsession with Terra Australis Incognita only deepened. It became a phantom that haunted the edges of every voyage. Explorers would catch a glimpse of a distant cloud bank or a looming iceberg and claim they had found the great southern continent. They were blinded by their own expectations, seeing what they wanted to see rather than what was actually there. They were trapped in a cycle of confirmation bias, where every scrap of land found in the southern latitudes, be it Tierra del Fuego or the northern coast of Australia, was heralded as the tip of this mythical, world-balancing giant. They could not conceive of a world where the south was mostly water, broken only by a single desolate and ice-covered heart. Meanwhile, the evidence of much earlier arrivals continued to sit quietly in the shadows, ignored by a mainstream history that was not yet ready to listen. We must consider the limits of what we know when we look at the stratigraphy of the southern islands, the study of the layers of earth and rock that act as a diary of the planet's past. In these layers, we find traces that don't always fit the neat timeline of the Age of Discovery. We find pollen from plants that shouldn't be there, or charcoal from fires that burned long before the first European sails appeared on the horizon. These are the whispers of the lost civilizations of the South, not necessarily empires with stone cities, but cultures of incredible sophistication who moved through the world with a lightness that left few marks for modern archaeology to find. The medieval maps, with their sprawling, imaginary southern continents, tell us more about the people who drew them than about the geography of the earth. They reveal a deep-seated human fear of the void. We find it difficult to accept that there might be vast, empty spaces that serve no purpose in our human dramas. We want the world to be full, to be balanced, and to be meaningful. The unknown southern land was a canvas onto which the medieval mind projected its hopes and its terrors. It was a place of monsters, yes, but also a place of infinite possibility. A land where the sun might stand still or where the rivers might flow with gold. As we move deeper into the history of this loneliest continent, we must hold these two truths in our minds: the grand intellectual illusions of the North and the quiet, practical discoveries of the South. One was a dream of how the world should be. The other was a direct encounter with how the world actually is. The transition from the mythical Terra Australis to the reality of Antarctica was not just a change in geography, but a fundamental shift in the human consciousness. It was the moment we began to realize that the Earth does not exist to serve our need for symmetry, and that the most profound mysteries are often found in the places that are the least hospitable to our presence. The ice of the South holds many things in its cold embrace. It holds the atmosphere of 1,000,000 years ago, trapped in tiny bubbles. It holds the dust of ancient volcanic eruptions and the chemical signatures of passing comets. And perhaps, buried beneath the shifting glaciers, it holds the remnants of those who saw the white peaks long before the first maps were ever drawn. As we look at the fading ink of the medieval charts, we see the ghost of a continent that never was, overlapping with the reality of a continent that has always been. It is a reminder that our knowledge is always a work in progress, a series of fragments gathered from the mists of time, waiting for the light of a new discovery to reveal the truth that has been hiding in plain sight, in the deep, cold quiet of the South. A single weathered wooden paddle, carved from the heartwood of a tropical tree, tells a story far older than the heavy iron anchors of the 19th century. When we hold these two objects in our minds, we are looking at two entirely different philosophies of discovery, two ways of understanding the vastness of the world that eventually collided in the freezing spray of the Southern Ocean. The explorers of the so-called heroic age, men like Scott and Shackleton, arrived with the weight of empires behind them, their pockets filled with chronometers, sextants, and leather-bound journals. They viewed the ice as a frontier to be conquered, a blank space on a map that required a name and a flag to truly exist. To them, discovery was an act of documentation, a scientific recording of coordinates and depths that would be filed away in the dusty archives of London or Paris. But long before the first steamship ever cut through the pack ice, another kind of discovery was taking place, one that didn't rely on ink or paper. The Polynesian navigators, the masters of the Pacific, viewed the ocean not as a barrier, but as a highway. Their maps were not drawn on parchment, but held in the mind, a complex web of star paths, bird migrations, and the subtle rhythm of the swells. When the navigator Ui-te-Rangiora reportedly sailed his vessel, the Te Tai-uka-a-pia, into the frozen mists of the south, he wasn't seeking to claim a territory for a king. He was following the natural progression of the world, chasing the horizon until the very nature of the water began to change. In the oral traditions of the Maori, this journey is preserved in the form of chants and genealogies, passed down through the generations like a living flame. There is a profound silence that exists between these two worlds of knowledge. The Western tradition relies on written logs, which provide a sense of linear time and concrete proof, but these documents are fragile, subject to the rot of damp cabins and the fires of history. Oral preservation, on the other hand, functions through repetition and sacred memory. It is a collective archive held by the community, where the details of a voyage are woven into the cultural identity of a people. For centuries, the stories of the rocks that grow out of the sea and the white feathers of the falling snow were dismissed by European scholars as mere myths or poetic exaggerations. They could not conceive of a small wooden craft surviving the fury of the roaring 40s or the screaming 50s, those latitudes where the wind circles the globe without a single landmass to break its strength. As we look closer at the history of maritime exploration, we see how often indigenous knowledge was overlooked, or perhaps more accurately, ignored. The explorers of the 1800s often arrived at new lands only to find people already living there, people who had names for every bay and every mountain peak. In the case of Antarctica, the lack of a permanent human population made it easier for the later explorers to claim the mantle of the first. They looked at the ice and saw a void, unaware that the memory of this place had already been carried northward centuries earlier. This creates a strange tension in our understanding of deep time, a gap between the physical footprints left in the snow and the linguistic footprints left in the stories of the Pacific. Consider the difference in how these two groups perceive the environment. The 19th century expeditions were often battles of endurance, characterized by struggle and a desperate need to survive against a hostile landscape. Their logs are filled with the technical language of the era, descriptions of barometric pressure and the precise measurements of ice flows. Meanwhile, the indigenous perspective often viewed the natural world as a continuum, where the ice was not an enemy, but another manifestation of the great ocean. The knowledge of how to read the clouds, or how to interpret the change in the color of the water as it nears a great landmass, was a form of science that predated the laboratory. It was a science of observation, refined over thousands of years of trial and error. We must ask ourselves what else has been lost in the transition from oral to written history. When a story is written down, it becomes fixed. A single version of events that is frozen in time, but an oral tradition is fluid. It breathes with the people who tell it. It allows for a different kind of truth to emerge, one that captures the feeling of the wind and the terror of the deep in a way that a dry ship's log never could. The contrast between these two worlds reminds us that our modern definition of discovery is often quite narrow. We tend to value the person who writes the report, rather than the person who first saw the horizon change. As the years passed and the maps of the world were slowly filled in, the achievements of the ancient navigators were pushed to the margins. The heroic age of Antarctic exploration became the dominant narrative, a story of brave men in wool coats fighting the elements, and while their courage was undeniable, it was only part of a much longer, much older story. The ghost of the Polynesian wake still lingers in the southern waters, a silent testament to a time when the world was larger and more mysterious than we can currently imagine. We are only now beginning to reconcile these two histories, to realize that the first people to see the great white continent didn't need a compass to find their way home. The technical tools of the modern age, from radiocarbon dating to the study of stratigraphy, which is simply the analysis of the layers of earth and ice laid down over time, are finally starting to catch up with the ancient stories. We are finding traces of wood, of seeds, and of charcoal in places where they shouldn't be, suggesting that the movement of people across the southern oceans was far more frequent and far more ancient than the history books once suggested. It is a humbling thought to realize that the loneliest continent may have had visitors who watched the aurora australis dance across the sky long before the first European mast appeared on the horizon. In this quiet space between the past and the present, we find a new kind of map emerging. It is a map that includes both the written word and the spoken word, the scientific data and the ancestral memory. It suggests that the discovery of Antarctica was not a single event, but a slow unfolding of human curiosity that spans 1,000 years. As we drift further into the history of this frozen world, we see that the ice preserves more than just the cold. It preserves the echoes of everyone who ever dared to sail toward the end of the world, whether they carried a pen or a paddle. The silence of the South is not an empty silence. It is a silence filled with the weight of forgotten ages, waiting for us to listen. To understand the secrets held within the ice, we must first learn to read the breath of the world as it was captured a millennium ago. Deep beneath the crushing weight of the polar plateau, there are layers of snow that fell during the time of the Vikings and the great Polynesian navigators. Snow that has never melted, but instead has been pressed into thin, translucent sheets of history. These ice cores are the Earth's most honest diary. Within them, microscopic bubbles of ancient air remain trapped, preserving the exact chemical composition of the atmosphere from the 10th and 11th centuries. When scientists extract these long, gleaming cylinders from the crust, they are looking at a frozen map of a different world. A world that was, for a brief window of time, far more welcoming to those who travelled by sea than the one we know today. During this era, roughly between the years 900 and 1300, the planet entered a phase known to climatologists as the medieval warm period. It was a time of subtle but profound shifts in the global pulse. In the northern hemisphere, vineyards flourished in places now too cold for grapes, and Norse settlers found green pastures on the coast of Greenland. But as we look toward the southern reaches, the evidence suggests a parallel transformation was taking place. The vast, churning currents of the Southern Ocean, which usually act as a frigid barrier between the world and the ice, began to shift their rhythm. The air grew slightly tempered, and the winds that usually howl with unrelenting ferocity seemed to catch their breath. This was not a tropical heat, but a softening of the edges of the world, a moment where the grip of the frost loosened just enough to allow the curious to slip through the gaps. The most significant change, however, was not found in the temperature of the air, but in the behavior of the sea ice. We often imagine the Antarctic ice as a permanent, solid wall, but it is actually a living, breathing entity that expands and contracts with the seasons. In our modern age, the pack ice can extend for hundreds of miles, a chaotic landscape of jagged floes and crushing bergs that would easily splinter a wooden hull. Yet, the paleoclimate data, the study of ancient weather patterns through biological and geological markers, tells us that during the medieval warm period, the summer melt was far more extensive. The great white fringe of the continent retreated. For a few decades at a time, the treacherous Ross Sea and the waters surrounding the Antarctic Peninsula may have been remarkably clear. offering wide blue lanes of open water where today there is only a grinding desert of white. As the ice retreated, it left behind a gateway. The navigation of the Southern Ocean has always been a battle against the screaming 60s, those latitudes where the wind circles the globe without any land to break its speed. But during this climatic anomaly, the pressure systems may have shifted, creating windows of calm that lasted just long enough for a sturdy vessel to make the crossing. We must imagine a navigator from the Pacific Islands, perhaps guided by the flight paths of migrating birds or the strange, deep-coloured reflections of ice on the underside of distant clouds, sailing south through waters that were uncharacteristically still. The science of stratigraphy, the study of how layers of earth and ice accumulate over time, shows us that the dust and pollen, trapped in the ice from this period, originated from distant lands, carried on winds that were behaving in ways we are only just beginning to model. The ocean itself changed its chemistry during this time. Variations in the salinity and the movement of deep-water currents suggest that the great conveyor belt of the sea was in a state of flux. For a sailor in a double-hulled canoe or a wooden ketch, this meant more than just warmer water. It meant a change in the very soul of the sea. The bioluminescence might have glowed more brightly in the wake of the oars, and the types of whales and seals that followed the krill would have moved further south, drawing human hunters along with them into the unknown. It is a haunting thought to consider that the geography of the earth is not a fixed thing, but a shifting tapestry, and that 1,000 years ago the map of what was possible was drawn with much wider boundaries. Yet the ice is a jealous guardian of its stories. While the medieval warm period provided the opportunity, it also created the conditions for the evidence to vanish. When sea ice thins and glaciers retreat, they often erase the very shorelines where a traveller might have landed. A temporary camp set upon a gravel beach 1,000 years ago would have been pulverized by the returning ice when the world began to cool again during the Little Ice Age. The heavy, grinding weight of the advancing glaciers acts like a giant eraser, scrubbing the continental shelf clean of anything that does not belong. This is the great frustration of Antarctic archaeology. We are looking for the traces of a dream in a place that has been frozen and thawed, crushed and reborn many times over. And so, we are left to piece together the truth from the smallest of clues. We look at the chemical signatures of penguin guano in ancient rookeries, which tell us when the birds moved and when the ice was too thick for them to feed. We look at the growth rings of sub-Antarctic trees on islands like the Auckland or the Kerguelens, which whisper of decades where the sun shone longer and the frost stayed away. These biological witnesses confirm that the environment of the 11th century was a rare anomaly, a brief, golden hour in the long, dark history of the southern latitudes. It was a time when the loneliest continent was perhaps not quite so lonely, when the barriers of ice were lowered, as if the earth itself were inviting the brave to see what lay at the bottom of the map. We must also consider the role of the Younger Dryas, a much older, much more sudden cooling event from nearly 12,000 years ago, which serves as a reminder of how quickly the world can change. While that event was a descent into cold, the medieval warm period was its opposite, a gentle rise that might have deceived travellers into thinking the southern seas were always so kind. If a fleet of voyagers reached the ice shelves in the year 1000, they would have seen a landscape that looked permanent and solid, unaware that they were standing in a fleeting window of time that would soon slam shut for the next 700 years. The ice cores show that by the 14th century, the temperatures plummeted, the pack ice returned with a vengeance, and any routes that had been opened were sealed away in a tomb of white. As we contemplate these ancient climate cycles, the mystery shifts from could they have reached it to how could they not have tried? The sea was open, the stars were clear, and the horizon was calling. The science tells us the path was there, a shimmering, temporary bridge made of salt water and sunlight. Whether or not the ancient mariners chose to cross it is a question that the wind still carries over the waves of the Southern Ocean, hidden in the spray and the silence of the bergs. The more we learn about the rhythm of the Earth's past, the more we realize that our ancestors did not live in a world of static borders, but in a fluid, changing landscape where even the most remote corners of the globe were occasionally within reach. The ice remembers the warmth, even if we have forgotten the names of those who felt it on their faces as they looked out over the edge of the world. The ground beneath an explorer's feet is rarely as solid as it seems, for the earth is a restless archivist, prone to misplacing its most precious records. When we look for the footprints of those who might have walked upon the southern ice a millennium ago, we are searching for shadows in a cathedral made of glass and wind. The fundamental difficulty of Antarctic archaeology lies in the very nature of the continent itself, a land that does not merely preserve, but actively consumes. Unlike the dry sands of Egypt or the oxygen-free bogs of northern Europe, the Antarctic fringe is a place of violent kinetic energy. To understand why the silence of the record is so profound, one must first consider the impossibility of the permanent. In almost every other corner of the globe, human presence is marked by the transformation of the landscape. We build walls of stone, we dig irrigation ditches, and we pile up middens of shell and bone that tell the story of our diet and our duration. But on the ice shelves of the far south, there is no stone to be quarried, and the ground itself is in a state of perpetual slow-motion flight. An ice shelf is not a floor. It is a river of frozen water, grinding its way toward the sea at a pace that mocks the brief lifespan of a human camp. Any structure built upon this white expanse would not stay where it was placed. Over the decades and the centuries, it would be carried outward, eventually carving into the salt water as an iceberg, taking its secrets down into the crushing depths of the Southern Ocean. The weather, too, acts as a corrosive agent of incredible power. We often think of the cold as a preservative, and in some senses it is. But the katabatic winds of Antarctica, those gravity-driven gales that tumble down from the high interior, are laden with ice crystals as sharp as industrial sand. These winds perform a slow, relentless erosion, scouring away organic materials like wood, skin, and fiber. A wooden hull left on a rocky outcropping would not rot in the traditional sense, for the air is too dry and cold for most fungi to thrive. Instead, it would be sand-blasted into dust, its fibers shredded by the wind until nothing remained but a memory. Even the most durable artifacts of a seafaring people, the harpoon tips of bone, the woven mats of flax, the stitched hides of a kayak, are fragile things when measured against the weight of 1,000 Antarctic winters. Archaeologists rely heavily on stratigraphy, which is the study of the layers of earth that accumulate over time, much like the pages of a book. In a typical excavation, the deeper you dig, the further back in time you travel. But in the high latitudes, the soil is often nothing more than shifting snow and seasonal meltwater. There is no stable accumulation of earth to hold an artifact in place. A stone tool dropped on the ice does not stay in its chronological layer. It sinks when the sun warms it, or it is heaved upward by the frost, migrating through the ice in a process that scrambles the historical record. By the time a modern researcher arrives, the evidence has been shuffled, diluted, and often cast away into the sea. And so, we are faced with the challenge of proving a landing without the benefit of stone structures. The cultures of the South Pacific, the master navigators, who are the most likely candidates for these early voyages, did not travel with the intent to build monuments of granite. Theirs was a civilization of organic brilliance, of wood and cordage, of bird bone and shell. They moved with the grace of the waves, leaving behind little that could withstand the grinding teeth of the glaciers. To find a trace of them is to look for a needle in a haystack that is itself moving and melting. we must also consider the chemical reality of the southern environment. In warmer climates, researchers use radiocarbon dating to determine the age of organic finds. This process measures the decay of carbon-14, an isotope that every living thing absorbs while it is alive. However, the Southern Ocean presents a unique obstacle known as the reservoir effect. Because the waters around Antarctica are filled with ancient, old carbon upwelling from the deep sea, the creatures that live there, the seals, the birds, and the fish, can appear centuries older than they actually are when their remains are tested. If an ancient traveller left behind a cloak made of seal skin, a modern laboratory might mistakenly date it to a period long before the traveller ever set sail. This chronological blurring makes it incredibly difficult to pin down a specific moment in time, leaving us to wander through a fog of possibilities where the dates refuse to align. As the years passed, the ice continued its patient work of erasure. We often imagine that history is a solid chain of events, but in truth, it is more like a tapestry with more holes than thread. The absence of evidence is not necessarily the evidence of absence. It is simply the reality of a world that does not always wish to be remembered. When we stand on the rocky shores of the Antarctic Peninsula and look out at the grey, churning water, we must accept that some stories are written in the wind and the spray, elements that leave no trace for the trowel or the brush. The silence of the archaeological record is not a void, but a quiet challenge. It asks us to look closer, to listen more intently to the oral traditions that speak of the frozen sea and the land where the sun sleeps. It forces us to acknowledge the limits of our own technology and the vastness of what we have lost to the passage of deep time. The ice remembers the warmth, and the wind carries the echoes of voices we can no longer hear. But for now, the physical proof remains hidden, buried beneath layers of frozen history that are as beautiful as they are impenetrable. The word discovery is a heavy one, carrying with it the weight of flags planted in frozen soil and names etched into the maps of empires. For centuries, we have been taught that the story of Antarctica began in the early 19th century, when wooden ships from Russia, Britain, and America first crested the horizon of the Southern Ocean. We have been told that this was a virgin land, a void on the map that remained untouched by human presence until the age of industrial exploration. But as we peer through the lens of deep time, we see that this definition of discovery is perhaps too narrow, a fragile construct built upon the written records of a few, while ignoring the whispered memories of many others who moved across the waters long before. To discover is not merely to claim, it is to encounter, to witness, and to hold a place in one's mind as part of the known world. As the years passed, the rigid boundaries of what we considered history began to soften. In the year 2021, a landmark study led by researchers from New Zealand brought a new clarity to this ancient mystery. Led by Priscilla Wehi, the team did not rely solely on the traditional tools of Western science, such as radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of carbon isotopes to determine the age of organic materials. Instead, they looked toward a different kind of archive, one that is often overlooked in the halls of academia, the oral traditions and the ancestral knowledge of the Maori people. Their findings suggested that the Southern Ocean and the fringes of the Antarctic continent were not unknown to the indigenous navigators of the Pacific. In fact, these voyagers may have been navigating the icy currents of the far south as early as the 7th century, more than 1,000 years before the first European vessels arrived. The study highlighted a fundamental shift in how we perceive exploration. It suggests that the history of the loneliest continent is not a short chapter of recent years, but a long, meandering narrative that stretches back into the depths of the first millennium. These early mariners did not leave behind the stone foundations of cities or the rusted relics of industry, but they left behind something perhaps more enduring, a connection to the environment that is woven into the very fabric of their culture. By integrating these oral traditions into the scientific record, we are not just adding names to a list of explorers. We are redefining what it means to know the Earth. We are acknowledging that the map of human experience was already vast and complex, while the rest of the world was still waking up to the scale of the globe. Think of the immense courage required to steer a double-hulled waka into the unknown, guided only by the stars, the patterns of the waves, and the flight of birds. To these navigators, the ocean was not a barrier, but a highway, a living entity that connected all things. As they pushed further south, the air would have grown brittle and sharp, and the familiar constellations would have shifted in the sky. They would have encountered the great white silence of the ice shelves and the towering bergs that drift like ghost ships through the fog. In the Maori stories, there are references to a place of extraordinary things, a realm where the mountains pierce the clouds and the sea is frozen into stone. These are not the flights of fancy of a storyteller. They are the observations of witnesses who saw the world at its most extreme. This integration of indigenous history and modern science represents a new frontier in archaeology and anthropology. It challenges the idea that civilization is something that only leaves behind physical monuments. Sometimes the most profound evidence of a journey is the way it changes the people who make it, the way it enters their songs, their carvings, and their understanding of their place in the universe. When we look at the ice now, we must see it not as a blank slate, but as a witness. The ice remembers the keels of ships that no longer exist, and it holds the echoes of languages that were spoken long before the first sextant was ever levelled at the sun. The importance of this shift cannot be overstated. By valuing oral tradition alongside stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and the sequence of events they represent, we begin to fill in the gaps of our collective memory. We start to understand that the human story is far more interconnected and far older than we dared to imagine. The sailors of the 7th century were not lost. They were exactly where they intended to be, pushing the limits of human endurance and curiosity. They were the first to stand at the edge of the world and look out at the frozen sea, feeling the same awe and trepidation that we feel today when we look toward the stars. As we move forward, the challenge for researchers is to remain humble in the face of what we do not know. The Southern Ocean is a restless guardian of its secrets, and much of the physical evidence of these early voyages may have been reclaimed by the sea or buried under miles of shifting ice. But the stories remain. They are the threads that connect us to the people of the deep past, those who moved with the rhythms of the earth and respected the power of the cold. They remind us that the history of Antarctica is not just a history of ice and stone, but a history of human spirit, a spirit that has always sought the horizon, no matter how distant or how frozen it may be. And so, we find ourselves at a crossroads of understanding. The narrative of the lone European explorer, battling the elements in a heroic vacuum, is being replaced by a richer, more diverse tapestry of human endeavor. It is a story that includes the Polynesian Wayfinders, the coastal peoples of South America, and perhaps others whose names have been entirely erased by the winds of time. It is a story that asks us to listen to the silence of the continent with new ears and to look at the vast white expanse with new eyes. The ice is no longer a wall, it is a bridge to a past that is finally beginning to speak. The shadows on the snow are long, stretching back through the centuries to a time when the world was still a place of infinite mystery. In those shadows, we find the ghosts of the first discoverers, the ones who didn't need a map because they were the ones drawing it with their lives. They remind us that the earth has always been smaller than our curiosity, yet larger than our ability to fully grasp its secrets. As we continue to peel back the layers of Antarctic history, we find that the more we learn, the more we realize how much remains hidden in the deep, quiet cold of the loneliest continent, waiting for the day when the ice finally decides to tell the rest of its tale. Perhaps the most profound way to understand this legacy is to imagine the first human eyes to ever witness the aurora australis, those shimmering, ethereal curtains of green and violet light that dance across the southern polar sky. Long before the era of steel-hulled ships and satellite navigation, these ancient travellers stood upon the decks of their wooden craft, perhaps drifting in the silent, slushy waters of the Ross Sea, and looked upward in a state of absolute wonder. To them, the lights were not a collision of solar particles and atmospheric gases, but a living bridge between the world of the living and the realm of the ancestors, a sign that they had reached the very edge of the known universe. The courage required to face such a landscape is almost impossible to quantify in our modern age of constant connectivity. We must remember that for the Polynesian navigators, or the lost mariners of even older eras, there were no rescue signals and no maps to follow. They moved through the world by reading the subtle language of the ocean, the taste of the spray, the specific vibration of the hull against the swell, and the way the clouds gathered over distant, unseen land masses. When they reached the ice, they were entering a cathedral of silence so vast that the sound of a single whale breaching or a glacier calving would have echoed like thunder across the frozen plains. It is a humbling thought to realize that the human spirit has always been restless, always pushing against the boundaries of the dark, seeking to understand what lies beyond the next horizon, even when that horizon offers nothing but cold and uncertainty. As we look back through the fog of deep time, the scale of the Antarctic wilderness remains its most daunting feature. It is a continent that does not care for human ambitions, a place where time is measured not in years or centuries, but in the slow, grinding movement of ice sheets that have persisted for millions of cycles. And yet, within this hostile expanse, we find the faint, persistent echoes of our own history. Whether it is a fragment of ancient wood trapped in a moraine or a geochemical signature in the ice cores that hints at distant fires, the evidence suggests that we have been here before. We are not the first to marvel at the southern stars, nor are we the first to feel small beneath the weight of the polar night. The explorers of the 19th century were not discovering a new world so much as they were reacquainting themselves with a forgotten one, stepping into footprints that had long since been filled with snow. There is a certain peace in acknowledging the limits of our knowledge. We often feel a desperate need to categorize every century and map every square inch of the earth, but Antarctica resists this impulse. It remains a sanctuary for the unknown, a place where the secrets of the past are kept under a lock of ice miles thick. We might wonder if there are shipwrecks resting in the deep trenches off the coast that would rewrite every history book ever written. Vessels that set sail from islands that no longer exist, manned by people whose names have been lost to the wind. These ghosts of the Southern Ocean are part of a larger story, a story of a planet that is far older and more mysterious than we usually care to admit. As the years pass and the ice continues its slow, inevitable pulse, we are reminded that the Earth is a living archive. Every layer of frost is a page. Every frozen lake is a time capsule waiting to be opened. The ancient navigators who first ventured into these waters were the vanguard of a curiosity that defines our species. They did not have the tools of modern science, but they possessed a profound understanding of their place in the natural order. They knew that to travel was to change, and to reach the end of the world was to find a new beginning within themselves. The legacy they left behind is not one of monuments or cities, but of a quiet, enduring bravery, a testament to the fact that no matter how cold the world becomes, the fire of human inquiry can never truly be extinguished. In the deep, rhythmic breathing of the southern winter, we can almost hear the voices of those who came before. They speak of a time when the stars were the only guides and the sea was a vast open road. They remind us that the wilderness is not something to be conquered, but something to be respected. a mirror that reflects our own fragility and our own strength. As we leave the shores of the loneliest continent and return to the warmth of our own lives, we carry a piece of that silence with us. We realize that the true value of history is not just in the facts we uncover, but in the sense of wonder we feel when we realize how much we have yet to learn. The ice will keep its secrets for a while longer, guarding the memories of the first people to see the light at the bottom of the world. And as we drift into sleep, we can imagine ourselves on that same ancient vessel, watching the aurora dance over a world that is as beautiful as it is eternal. The journey through the southern latitudes is a journey into the heart of the unknown. It is a place where the air is so clear that the mountains seem to lean in toward you, and the water is so blue it feels like a dream of the sky. In this stillness, the boundaries between the past and the present begin to dissolve. We can see the silhouettes of the great canoes and the early sailing ships blending into the mist, all of them part of the same long, unbroken line of seekers. They were driven by the same questions that drive us today, questions about where we come from and what lies beyond the edge of the map. And while the answers may be buried deep beneath the permafrost, the quest itself is what makes us who we are. As the darkness of the polar night settles over the landscape, the ice begins to sing, a low, resonant humming caused by the shifting of the great plates. It is a sound that has been heard for eons, a song of the earth that predates the first human breath. To listen to it is to hear the heartbeat of the world. It is a reminder that we are but a brief moment in the long history of the planet, a single spark in a vast and ancient fire. Yet, in that spark, there is a light that can bridge the gaps between civilizations and across the millennia. We are connected to the ancient navigators by our shared wonder, by our shared fear, and by our shared capacity to dream of what lies hidden in the deep, quiet cold. And so, we leave the frozen continent to its long white slumber. The snow continues to fall, covering the tracks of the explorers and the secrets of the ancients, preserving them for a future that may one day be ready to understand them. Until then, the southern lights will continue to flicker over the empty plains, a silent tribute to the courage of those who first dared to look upon them. The wind will carry their stories across the ice, whispering them to the mountains and the sea, ensuring that even if their names are forgotten, their spirit remains a part of the eternal landscape. In the stillness of the night, we find a sense of belonging, a realization that we are all travelers on a journey through time, seeking the same light in the darkness, and finding comfort in the knowledge that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, tucked away in the heart of the ice at the very edge of the world.